Hello, and welcome back to The Vault. I'm Trisha Taurinskas. This is the last of 3 episodes following up on our 2024 reporting about the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, which has some roots in the town of Nitchie, North Dakota. In the first 2 episodes, we talked with Chris Hagan and Drew Trafton about their reporting. Plus, we heard from Alona Lyons, a former member. Alona talked about being sexually assaulted numerous times as a child and told us how making her decision to leave meant separating herself from her loved ones. If you haven't, be sure to listen back to episode 2 in this series to hear her story. For this episode, we turn to another former member, Carman Drever, who has become an outspoken critic of the church since leaving in 2004. Her grandfather was the universal leader of the church at one time. Her perspective allows us a glimpse at the inner workings of the church at its highest levels. And it also shows us how that leadership cultivated an environment of fear to control its members. Here's Carman, and for the record, I spoke with her in September of 2024. So first, can you tell us how long you were a member of the PBCC? We'll start there.
I was a member of the PBCC for 33 years. The first 33 years of life.
So you were born into it?
Yes, I was born into it. Let's see, on Dad's side, it would have been 4th generation. On Mom's side, it would have been 3rd generation.
Okay. And what side? We know James Symington, who was a former Universal leader, was your granddad, your grandpa. Obviously, I guess that would have been on your father's side. Can you speak about that, the significance of that within your experience in the church?
Yes, speaking about that, it's funny, you can look at that from a positive point of view, and you can look at it as, I was very sheltered. So I have kind of a double look at that. Growing up in it with him as my grandfather, he was like everybody's grandfather. He loved his grandchildren. He was, very close to his grandchildren, especially I think us, because our dad was killed in a construction accident when I was only 5.
Right. Okay.
My youngest brother was not even born yet when we lost Dad.
Oh.
So one thing that Grandpa did is he tried to sort of compensate a little bit for that. And every Friday night that he was home, we had dinner at their house. And he was just like everybody's grandpa. I mean, you sat around the table and he asked us about our week at school. That was our chance to chat with him every week. And in the early years, I think I viewed him as the same as every other grandfather around. I don't think I didn't know his significance until I got a little bit older.
Oh, interesting. And to put things in perspective, I mean, obviously the PBC exists around the world, and you all were located in Nitchie?
Yes, in Nitchie, North Dakota, in small town USA. And growing up in that, I mean, I remember seeing a lot of people from all over the world. We had a lot of company. We got to know different people all the way around the world, but it wasn't until my middle school years that I realized that was different than what the rest of the people in my class grew up around.
Oh, interesting.
Because I remember us having the Catholic kids in school always went to catechism once a week. And other kids had other things that they did for their church and for their religion and whatever. For me, we had company all the time for all the way, from all around the world. And I remember us discussing it, like, the Catholic kids would be like, oh, it's Wednesday, we got to go to catechism. And that was their little buzz. For us, it was, oh, it's the fellowship meeting. We're going to have lots of company. So it wasn't until middle school that I started to realize that, okay, this is different than everybody else's church,
During that time, were you going to a school with other people? I mean, of other faiths? You mentioned it wasn't the Plymouth Brethren specific school. The
Yes.
One Church Global?
Yes. I consider that my saving grace. Growing up, we were not separated yet. We were
Oh,
allowed to go to the public school. So we still knew there was other people out there in the world. One
okay.
of my hugest concerns now is the PBCC are segregating their children so much that in some cases, I wonder, are they even aware that they're being pulled separate from the whole rest of the world around them?
Yeah. I mean, that was my question. One of the questions I had for you was, when you were roughly, say, 10 years old, what was your impression of the outside world? And what I'm hearing is that it would have been very different for you than kids now who are, say, 10 years old.
Yes. I mean, one thing about being brought up in all of these very exclusive religions is, and it's funny that I realize it now, that it's one thing that all cults have in common. They teach their people that you are special. You have a special
Mm,
light. You've been chosen by God. You've been taken out of all the rest of the people in the world. And
mm.
in my growing up years, I only ever heard that. And we were taught we were special. We were a special group and that we were being taught things that nobody else in the world knew. Um, and as coming away from it, all of a sudden you realize, hey, wait a minute. There's a lot of groups out here that are professing the same thing.
Were you allowed in public school to have friendships with people of other faiths?
No, no. Now, we had interclass, like I was always very chatty with everybody in my class. At
Hmm.
that point, that was considered the norm. But we never had any outside the school relationships.
Okay.
And back when, and this is a difference from back then to now. I mean, back then we were so busy. And so as soon as school was out, you would run home and, have your supper and get changed and get ready to go to church. So the lack of friendships with all the people around you wasn't such a big deal. Now they don't go to church as much as they used to, and they have a lot more free time. And I often wonder, without friendships, what do they fill their time with?
Hmm. Yeah. Did you go on to graduate high school in a
I did.
public school?
I sure did. I graduated out of Nitchie in 1989 with the rest of my class.
Okay. And what was the expectation that was put on you for what to do after graduation?
And as girls, we were expected to graduate. And if we held a job, we would hold a job for a year.
Mm,
It was usually said back then that, you know, you might have to work for a little bit after you got out of high school, but the immediate expectation is that you would get married
mhm,
and you would be a mom.
mhm. Oh,
And that was your whole goal in life, was that you would get married and raise your own family. There was nothing past, that 1 year out of high school. The expectation for a woman to earn money, there was none. It was frowned on, and it was not even something that you ever even thought of.
I would imagine that a lot of you, girls and boys, started thinking about who they were going to marry in high school. Is
Oh,
that how it went?
absolutely. Absolutely. That was, I mean, I think we thought of it for the last 4 years of high school.
Mm,
And then being raised in Nitchie, North Dakota, and having all this company coming in all the time. So
sure.
once a month, being in Nitchie, North Dakota, we had what we called the fellowship meeting. And the fellowship meeting would bring in 500 to 700 people from all across the world.
Wow.
So once a month, you would go to this great big gathering and you would see all the young people and the adults. And of course, being a young people, you were looking at all the other young people, and, it was
Hmm.
always kind of this little game where, oh, this guy is so cute and this guy is not.
Hmm.
I mean, we were like normal teenagers.
Sure.
The only thing is, you were kept within that group.
Interesting. Were you allowed to marry then? Like, well, obviously there are people, like you said, from all over the world. How would that work in terms of where you would live after marriage? If, say, someone was from Australia, you're from Nitchie, where do you go?
The girls always went to where the husband was from.
Okay.
So that was also built into your sort of decision when you were looking at all these guys.
Hmm.
You're remembering where they came from and were you prepared to move there? because that definitely factored into the decision.
Yeah. Did you have any friends within the PBC who ended up going overseas or elsewhere?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I mean, the people my age are all over the world.
Wow.
It's gotten more so now than it even was then.
Mm-hmm.
When I grew up, we were sort of restricted to North America. And now the kids can plan on going anywhere in the world.
It's interesting. I suppose that it's true for the entire world. The world seems a little bit smaller, but do finances play into that now with the businesses that exist?
Yes, yes. And I think there's a lot more, they don't get married as young as they used to. They do, once they graduate from high school, they do tend to, I think now it's sort of promoted the age around 20, 21, 22, somewhere in that area. We got married at 18, which in a lot of ways was very young because we were
Yeah.
still so young.
Oh, goodness. Very young.
Now they tend to be a little bit older and they get out, they graduate, and then they tend to work a little bit longer, which lends to a lot more financial security when they do get married.
Mm-hmm.
So the girl tends to have a little bit more money and she has a little bit steadier outlook on where she wants to go and who she wants to get married to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually I would look at as a plus.
And do they have, boys and girls both have to, or at that point, men and women, do they both have to work within PBCC businesses strictly?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, when I graduated, the job field and the choices, as long as you stayed within the confines of what the religion allowed, you could do any job you wanted. Now they are restricted to only work for PBCC employers.
Okay. What was a typical job for a girl in that 1 year time frame before marriage?
Most often, I think most girls would have looked for an office job.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of a short-term office job, because we all knew, your goal was to get married. Your goal was not to work very long.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just a 1 year period where you just worked a quick job with the goal of getting married.
I'd like to go back to when you were growing up. Obviously, you said it's different than now because one school global didn't exist, so you were able to at least see people in the outside world. I'm curious what age or age range you were when you felt like something maybe wasn't quite right, and maybe it came in adulthood. I guess I'm just curious.
So growing up in our younger years, it just sort of, there were so many of us in Niche, North Dakota, so many brethren in Niche, North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
The concentration of us versus the other people in the school, there was just so many of us that you didn't notice the difference as much.
Oh, interesting.
Then as we got a little bit older, you started to notice the difference, even from the perspective of your classmates. I think going into that 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, there was sort of a period where we all kind of, you go through a period of, okay, am I going to stick with this forever or not?
Mm.
There's kind of, and I know the Amish do it, and I know the Hutterites do it. They have sort of this period of time where kids develop your own mindset. Like, are you going to go towards getting married and staying in this church? Or, some kids got a little bit of itchy feet and tried out what it would be like to not be in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in my time period, I think there was more tolerance for it than there is now.
To have that adventurous time, or just to see what life is like outside so you can make that decision.
Yes. And I think also that's one of the dangers of this, segregating their kids and keeping them in a school with just only their own peers. I think that one of the reasons that the Haleses focused so much on doing that is it took away that time period where you made up your own mind if you were going to stick with the PBCC or not. By keeping kids segregated and trying to make them think this is the only way of life and you are special, you are chosen, we have kept you in this one school to protect you from all these evil people outside, you are taking away that desire for kids to see anything outside those four walls.
Right. Yeah. What choice did you make at that point?
At that point, I made the choice to go ahead and get married and stick within the religion.
Okay. And how old were you?
18 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. I got married at 18.
Did you go on to have children?
I did. I moved to Canada. My husband was from Saskatchewan, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
Which physical distance was only about 12 hours from Nitchie, North Dakota. In atmosphere and environment, it was a whole world away.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's funny when you think about it, because you might think Nitchie, North Dakota is about as remote as there is.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I live in Tennessee, I think right up there on the Canadian border in North Dakota is about as remote and as out of the way as there is.
Oh, yeah.
For us, though, growing up, it was literally the center of the PBCC.
That is so wild. Yeah.
That is where my grandpa Simonton lived. And the whole PBCC religion was run out of Nitchie, North Dakota.
Capital of the world.
Capital of the
For you
world.
guys.
If you're Plymouth Brethren Christian Church.
Yeah. Who would have thought?
Yeah, exactly.
So you moved to Saskatchewan, and then you had how many kids?
Yes. So I moved to Saskatchewan, very young, married, 18 years old. And we had 5 kids. My 5th child was born in 1996.
Okay. How far apart were they? Was it pretty? This is just getting personal here because I have 3 kids.
Okay, she got married in 1989. By 1996, she has 5 kids. Is she crazy or what?
Well, it's a lot of work. I know that.
It's funny. And in having 5 kids that close together, there was a lot of people that had a lot of questions. They're like, do you not know what caused that?
Yeah. Yeah.
But in all honesty, though, that was how we grew up. Birth control in the Plymouth Brethren was very similar to the Catholics and a lot of very exclusive kind of groups. They didn't believe in it. It was a no-no. It was taboo. You know, you had your children and you accepted them as they came. And in my case, there was 5 in a row. And I loved every last one of them. And I would not have changed that for one thing in the world. I was a mom. I was destined to be a mom. I loved my kids. It was the best thing in life, you know?
Yeah.
However, moving to Maple Creek, Saskatchewan brought a whole challenge in and of itself. You think growing up in Nitchie, North Dakota, being in the very center of the Plymouth Brethren, sheltered is not something that comes to mind because you're exposed to it every single month, you know? When I got to Saskatchewan, I realized I was indeed sheltered. And I think Saskatchewan itself and Canada, like just that area of Canada, is very remote. And what you found is that people there, they were not in the center of the way things were done. They took everything literally. And so all the rules were hard and fast. There was not a lot of grace.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden, attending church there, I realized, oh my goodness, this is so different from church where I grew up.
Who made that decision? I'm just curious how that would work. Is there someone, leadership in that specific area that dictated that sort of interpretation and how it was carried out? I
think you could, it's definitely goes back to leadership. Yeah. I also think that that's a cowboy climate up there, and it's a very harsh area of the world. Yeah. And I think that did factor into it a little bit, but I do think a lot of it was on the local leadership. I guess it's like any group. You have leaders in remote areas. They're going to take the rules and administer them in their own way. Mm-hmm. The way they administered the rules in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan was hardline. It was harsh. There was absolutely no grace. It was hard and fast. Everything was in black and white. There was no gray areas. And you dealt with it publicly. And I was horrified. It was just such a shock. And the first year, I kind of sat back and thought, wait, what? This is like I've been transported to a whole different universe, you know?
Yeah. Can you give us an example of maybe some of where you saw that black and white attitude in that first year?
In Nitchie, North Dakota, when we went to church to meeting, we would go, and if it was a Bible reading, you might read a scripture, and in their view, this would be it's like a Bible reading, and they would just sort of, everybody would chip in and talk about what they thought that it meant, and it was more of, I'm trying to think in the Baptist church what to compare it to, but it's more like a church gathering, and where all the men would sort of speak up and say what they thought the scripture meant. They might bring in some practical day-to-day life application to it,
Mm-hmm.
but it was generally it wasn't confrontational. There wasn't a lot of conflict. Let's put it that
Okay.
way.
Yeah.
So
Wasn't a
I moved
debate.
out to Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. In Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, you go to meeting and you think you should be in a very similar environment. And what I noticed right away was it was very polarized. There was a lot of animosity between the families, which had come from, I guess, a lifetime of hardlined application of the rules. I was walking in there from Nitchie, North Dakota. I had no idea these factions existed inside Maple Creek. So you walk in there and the meetings would dissolve into this conflict where obviously the guy that has read the scripture with an application in mind to get at someone. And, walking in there cold from outside, at first I was like, good grief, who is he talking about? Like you have the impression he's talking about someone. And it took me a couple of years to figure out who he was talking about, just by generally picking up stories from around the atmosphere. And then what I realized is that he was talking at young people. And it would turn into meetings that turned into like things that I had always thought happened at home. If you did something wrong, you would expect your mom or your dad, or, in my case, it was always a mom,
Mm-hmm.
that would admonish you for. They were using their church sessions to yell at young people. And it wouldn't be their own child. It would be someone else's child. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've never heard of this being taken care of inside your Bible readings.
Were parents expected to take those issues that they had with their child? And I don't even know if you can call it an issue, but it's just parenting and raising a child. Were they expected to take any sort of concern to those leaders?
They were, yes, definitely. Yes, you always took your concerns to the leaders. Yes. And I think that may have been some of the mistake in Maple Creek, is parents would say, hey, my kid is having an issue with something, where, now that I've got out into the big bad world, if a problem got so huge that I needed some help with it, you might talk to the child's counselor at church and say, hey, can you help me guide my child in this direction, or I have a concern, or can we work together on this and discuss it with a child? That would always be done in private.
Mm-hmm.
In Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, it was done right out in the meeting. And the parents were not allowed to stick up for their child in that setting. If you did, that would be like automatically you are against the church and they would get rid of you. By about 6 months to a year in, I realized they were actually getting rid of young people for the craziest things. Sometimes they weren't even discussing it with the child before they would call the parents and say, your child has been confined. We'll talk to you after the meeting about why.
So zero tolerance.
Zero tolerance, black and white, hard rules, and rules that, even though I grew up in the center of the church, I had never heard.
Yeah.
You would think someone that grew up, this is my grandpa that's supposed to have made this rule. These were rules that I had never heard of. And I'm sure that if they had been applied to me, I would not have been there. I was not viewed as a bad kid. But it's just that if you have zero tolerance,
Yeah.
and some of this stuff was almost like they were making it up to get rid of kids.
What's the process of getting rid of a kid?
In Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, it was pretty black and white. If the leader in the locality had heard something that Susie Bob had done, and he took it to truth to him, he would come out to the meeting, and I should have said, Jim Bob had done, because it was more to the young boys. But he did do it to young girls too in the meeting. And the sad part about this is women are not allowed to speak in their church sessions or in their church readings.
At all.
At all. Zero tolerance for women to speak. So if he came to the meeting with a story about Susie Bob, and he ranted and carried on and read a scripture that he thought applied to that terrible sin that she had committed, we're talking about she might have spoken to a young friend that she went to school with outside on the sidewalk. This was one of the critical sins that might be committed by someone. If he came to the meeting and he knew this story and he thought it was true, he would come to meeting and give this ranting, raving, yelling meeting, which was usually about an hour long, about why young sisters should not be speaking to people of the world and friends of the world and how sinful it was. And I mean, the negative scriptures in the Bible, and I call them negative, not because I think now they are negative, but because they use them in a negative sense. They would take some scripture and they would apply it to that situation, and then they would rant and rave for a whole hour about this poor young girl. And of course, the poor young girl, she might know or she might not know that it was her that they were getting at, but it was pretty obvious that it was one young person. And she couldn't even defend herself.
I can't imagine the fear of being a child. Being a teenager is hard anyway, and you're going to mess up no matter where you are, or what society you're brought up in, and so I just can't imagine the fear that teenagers had. It
was awful. It was so unhealthy. And for me as a mom sitting there, a new mom, I just had little children at that time. The first one was, born 12 months after we got married. And then the second one was born a year later. And just seeing these beautiful little children and then looking at these teenagers.
Oh, yeah.
I just sat there and thought, you're not going to do that to my child.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And maybe that's the mom part of me. I couldn't understand why parents would come to the church gathering and allow this to happen to their kids. Because it wasn't even my kid, and I wanted to stand up and say, stop this. This is not appropriate in a church setting, in any church setting. Because I know that Grandpa Symington would tear apart people in church, and I even at that time didn't feel like that was the right thing to do. I even felt uncomfortable when he did it.
Yeah.
But these people were doing it so personally at like a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. It literally took everything in me to just sit there and pretend like this was normal. Because everything in me, looking at my little children in my arms, was thinking, you can't do this to someone else's child.
Yeah. And those parents at that point who had their children being spoken about, I'm assuming they were also fearful?
So fearful they would not have dared to say a word. And that's the really sad part, is a lot of the people that were in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, married from right in that area. So they had become accustomed to this. And to them, it was normal. To me, it was the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. And I think that's one of the things that I think is so dangerous about an exclusive group like this. When things get out of control, it like inbreeds, and then it becomes the new normal. And then it gets worse and worse. And that's literally what Maple Creek got to be. It got to be a place where you could not raise children and expect them to stay with the group.
Yeah.
Now you say, and you might say to me, so if your children decide not to stay with the group, what's the big deal with that? Like, can they not still be your children and just choose a different life path? The problem with Plymouth Brethren Christian Church is if a child decides not to stay with the group, they cannot take a different life path and still have any contact to do with you. So in reality, what happens is if a child says, hey, I don't want to be part of this church anymore, you're giving up that child. You have no more contact with that child. You can have nothing more to do with them. It's like the child has died.
It's incredibly sad and terrifying for a parent to know. I mean, every parent, doesn't even want to think about their child passing on before them, but living in that community, knowing that someone else could make a decision to have your child leave the church, or your child could make that decision, and then they are just gone out of your life forever.
And that's exactly what it was.
Did that happen a lot?
In Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, the first 7 years that I was there was 20 young people that happened to.
20?
20. 20.
How many people were in that community?
150.
So that's a pretty big number.
It's a huge number. And I think that was the really shocking thing to me. And it was in that 7 years that I realized there was something seriously wrong with this whole system, that this would be allowed to happen. And the thing is, when they got rid of someone's child, then they would go on to minister to the church that this person had been shunned from the church. They'd been excommunicated, or in their words, they called it withdrawn from.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like an assembly death. And they would use that verbiage. This is like an assembly death. You need to view this person as they have died. Jeez. You can have nothing more to do with them. Their siblings can have nothing more to do with them. They're taken out of your will. It is like a concise separation. The child is gone.
And at the heart of that, what is the reasoning?
The reasoning goes back to the principle that they have separated the PBCC from every other religion. And they separate themselves because of the scripture in 2 Timothy 2, where it says there's vessels to honor, vessels to dishonor. Separate yourself from these. And they have taken that to mean physical separation from anyone that does not follow their principles and their rules and their understanding of the Bible.
So these parents who are told, look, your child is dead. This is a complete cutoff. Yep. Are they also led to believe then too that they are eternally damned?
Yes. And that has become more pronounced in the recent 25 years of the Hales regime. That has become much more pronounced. And I think that it is a control tactic. It is definitely a very cultic part of them, is that in order to scare the kids not to even have a thought of what's outside the PBCC, they have preached eternal damnation to anybody that has left from their group. Mm-hmm. Bruce Hales himself often refers to opposers. Anyone that has left and then spoken out about them is referred to as opposers. And he has ministered that they have a very special spot in hell.
Wow. My understanding is that is actually what prompted your exit from the PBCC, the way that they were essentially getting rid of children.
Yes, definitely. Okay. In that 7 years, watching these young children just get, just removed from families and thrown outside the church, and watching, I guess I didn't buy into the whole separation thing as much as a lot of people there. Mm-hmm. And I still was observing all these young children on the streets of Maple Creek, as young as 13 and 14 years old.
I was going to ask, was there any sort of process for them outside of the church? Were they taken into foster care? Were they just let go to survive on their own?
That's a really important question that I think needs to be addressed. Oftentimes, no. There were some situations where the parents might have rented out an apartment for them, but otherwise they were virtually left on their own.
Even young girls and young boys. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is trafficking. It's abduction. It's really nothing good that's going to come from a child as young as 13 out there trying to survive in a world where they've never really lived.
100% agree. 100% agree. And I've often wondered, when you think of our DCS system, when DCS takes a child away from its parents, it is put into a foster situation where, first of all, it has to be a really critical situation before they take a child away from parents. It has to be something that is life-threatening and dangerous to a child.
Right.
It's definitely not because the child doesn't agree with the way the parents are living their life,
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And then when they're put into a foster home, there's always follow-up care. There's, meetings with the parents. There's where it's appropriate, but there's a whole system that follows up afterwards.
Yeah.
When children get thrown out of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, they're thrown out of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church onto the street on their own. And that was one of the horrifying things to me, is to watch these young children. And some of them were living in a house, separate from their parents. They might be 16 years old by then. But those are kids. They're not set to live in the world. I mean, they're not equipped for that.
No.
First of all, they've been brought up in this very sheltered environment where there's no TV, no radio, no computers, no link with the world around them. And you've literally tossed them out into the big bad world. You fed them to the wolves with no follow-up.
And told them that they can never see their family again. I mean, it's astonishing to hear. Can we go through just to back up a little bit, what that process is to kick a kid out of the church? Is there like a certain steps they go through, or is it really just up to the discretion of the leaders?
Okay, so that is actually a really good topic. In Nitchie, where I grew up, and there was a young girl that was close to my same age, that kind of got thrown out, and I often wondered if the whole steps had been followed with her. But other than her, I didn't see people my same age that had ever encountered this process. It just wasn't that common in Nitchie. Where I move out to Maple Creek, this has been a historical problem in Maple Creek. And I knew that when I got married and moved out there. I knew there was a lot of young people that had left there. But you're young, and you don't really think about that. Then you get out there and you see these kids, and they could do the most minute things. And all of a sudden, you come out to meeting and you're conscious that there's like something going on, a world war simmering somewhere. And they would, the leading brother would pick up the mic and say, Susie Bob was caught today in a worldly friendship, and we feel like it's the best thing for her and her family if we confine them. This is usually the first step. Shut them up or confine them.
How?
And what that entails is Susie Bob and her parents are no longer allowed to attend any of the meetings. They're not allowed to have to do with any of the other people in the church. And any of her siblings at this point have to make a decision. Do they want to stay in the confined or shut up household with their parents, or do they want to go live with someone else that is still able to attend all the meetings?
Oh.
This is your whole social environment. So do you want to go live with somebody else so you can still go to the meeting and have to do with your friends? Or do you want to live with your mom and dad and Susie Bob, who is a naughty girl? Oftentimes, this is where the sexual assault and those kind of problems come in, is that you have kids living in other households that were not even their own kids. And, if DCS started randomly placing kids with anybody around here, this is one of the things that you would see. And I think that that's where we saw that come in the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. You start moving children from under their own parents and randomly placing them with other people, there's going to be problems because there's no safety mechanism there.
What would happen if a child did say, they raised the flag and said they were sexually abused or abused in general?
They were often not believed. I didn't see it happen a lot, or I didn't know of it. I've heard so much of it now after having left. I think that goes back to the fact that I don't think they dared to speak about it. Because there was so much fear of not being believed. And then the few that did speak of it, it was always turned back on the girls, it seemed like.
Yeah.
Many of the young girls that I've talked to since having left, and even the ones that I knew of that were going through all these issues, they just always spoke about not being believed. It's a horror show for young girls.
Yeah, completely. I would imagine, too, they were afraid not just of not being believed, but, like you said, of having it be turned into their fault, which I'm assuming could be grounds for being separated from your family and out on the street.
Yep, exactly. And that was sort of what they had to weigh in coming forward. You have to weigh this sort of, is it worth it to get help? Or is the risk of being tossed out of my family, being shut up, being withdrawn from myself, is it worth that? The very lack of attention to it and the very lack of concern on the leadership part about these sorts of things often made young girls very reluctant to even bring it up.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Like you said, there are no safeguards, and without any safeguards and no system in place, there is no opportunity for justice.
Exactly.
So that's, on a personal note, that's a very upsetting part of, reading this story and watching the documentary. It's incredibly sad to me, especially with, the girls who grow up in the church and don't know any different. It just seems just absolutely heartbreaking. I'd like to talk about, so after the confinement, is that somewhat of a test period, or is there a certain number of days, or how does that work?
It's usually considered the test period. From growing up in Nitschke, that was often kept to be a very short time period. Going out to Maple Creek, they kind of used it as, I don't know, sometimes I even felt like it was a form of punishment. And that sounds terrible, but that was actually the feeling that you got. It was like to try and force kids to be fearful, to do anything that they were not supposed to, or whatever, will shut you up. Like it was like a threat that was held over top of young people. So there was this shorter period of confinement. And then during this period of confinement, from the kids' point of view, this was a time when you were at home just with your parents, and you were supposed to get these priestly visits. These were time periods where, a couple of the elders of the church would come over and sit down with you and discuss what you had done, and why it was wrong according to the Plymouth Brethren principles and where it was wrong biblically. What I noticed right away in Maple Creek is a lot of those visits got way out of hand. By way out of hand, I would say it was worse than any school principal I'd ever heard of, any teacher I'd ever heard of, and certainly worse than my mom had ever been to us. It would involve 2 or 3 men from the church, always the men. They never took women on priestly visits. And it would often end up in this huge conflict where kids were screaming at the priests, and the priests had no self-control and would be screaming back at the kids and threatening the kids. And it just was not a positive experience for the kids. So during this period of shut up, where you're supposed to be making this decision whether you're going to be a good girl or a bad girl, often the priestly visits would lead to this decision where I'm having nothing more to do with these people.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's so unlike the church systems out here, where if you had reached out for pastoral care, it was a private interview and it was a calm environment. This was completely the adverse opposite. And it often led to the kids saying, no, I'm not going to do this. And then they would move away from the parents. And then the knife came down. The kids were on their own.
And I'm just thinking about how they would feel too in that moment with being yelled at and being treated so harshly in their parents' home. It would make sense that they didn't feel like their parents were protecting them. And so, which would make your decision, a little bit more, I don't want to say easier to make, but being put in a situation where you don't feel like your parents are standing up for you. So,
exactly. And it only added to the resentment. It further destroyed the relationship.
Would the leaders ever just say, look, after those visits, that's it? Like, you are not redeemable and you need to leave?
Unfortunately, yes. And that's where the problem came in. Supposedly, they would bring the matter to the assembly, and then they would go back to the kid and say, the assembly has withdrawn from you, so you're done. You're gone. We will have nothing more to do with you.
Wow.
In reality, when they brought it to the assembly, they would come to the assembly with whatever it was that the child had done that they considered irredeemable. And they would say, I believe it is in the assembly's interest that we withdraw from this person. So in all actuality, it was not an assembly judgment. It was a leader of the assembly brought it there, announced this is what we were going to do, and then went back to the kid. The rest of the other 146 people that were sitting in there would never have dared to contradict that. Because it would have ended up in you being outside there too.
Right. Yeah. Again, going back to the fear, there's so much to lose.
Yeah. Yeah. And the whole system, unfortunately, is built on that fear.
Yeah.
Me sitting there in that 7 years said, I can't raise children in this fear. It is not healthy and it will not end well.
So what did you do? What was your first step or first steps?
My first steps was, first of all, to sit down with a Bible all by myself, get rid of all of this ministry, put it all away, and sit down with the Bible. And as I read it, it just didn't line up with what they were doing. I'm like, this does not match with the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. It didn't match with what I grew up in. But I tried to set that to the side and say, okay, I need to go back to the very basic foundation. And there's just nothing that lined up with what I found in the Bible. So then I started to discuss it with my husband. And, as we dug into it, he started to go, whoa, this is like way wrong. And I would try to say to him, like in Nietzsche, we would never have done this. And it started to, he started to go, whoa, wait a minute. I thought this is what we were supposed to do. These were rules that I thought your grandpa said,
Oh boy.
Yeah. And as we went through probably about a year process where we kind of discussed everything. And then he realized how crazy the whole system was. So we together sat down and we went, okay, we're not going to raise our kids in this the way it is here in Maple Creek. We can't. I wasn't prepared to keep going to meeting and hear all this yelling at each other, all this conflict. That to me just was not a Bible reading. So we finally decided we were going to write to the leader of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church about all these kids. And we did. We sat down and we wrote a 5-page letter. We just gave little details of what was going on. And we backed it with the Bible, different things in the Bible where we thought it didn't line up with the Bible. Or our interpretation of what the Bible was trying to say. Amazingly, the leader agreed with us. And he told us that. But in doing that, we for lack of a better word, we pissed off the leadership in Maple Creek.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
That is not the nicest word I could have used, but that is literally what happened.
Yeah, it came back to them.
They were not used to being crossed. And they were not used to people saying what you're doing is wrong. They had a free reign for quite some period of time, and nobody contradicted them. And I understand why. After it was all over with, I understand why. And I can laugh about it now, but at that time, it was like this period of, it was awful.
I can't imagine.
Because then we got to experience what a priestly visit was like.
Oh, I bet you did.
All the prior experiences was just definitely what we had been told. And oftentimes it was young people that told us, did you know this happened?
Yeah.
And having heard it, you always sort of allow for a little bit of exaggeration. And you try to calm down the situation, and you try to make the best of it and smooth it over and discuss with them, try and help people. That was always my sort of approach to stuff. Mm-hmm. When we got our own priestly visit, oh my goodness, I'd never sat through anything like it in my whole life. You have these 3 old men. In our case, there was 4. I don't know why they thought there needed 4, but okay. I'm the only woman there because it's just me and Rick. And you're sitting across from 4 old men from the church, and they were angry. They were furious that we had defied them. You are not supposed to take the details of what goes on in Maple Creek and write about it and send it to the leadership. I betrayed all their confidences, and how dare we, as a young couple, take issue with what they were doing in Maple Creek. It's their Maple Creek. How dare we?
Gosh.
The first priestly visit went on for, I think, 3 hours.
3 hours.
And I have never sat in an environment like that for so long. I mean, the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And you've got these 3 old crows sitting across from you with this condemning look on their face. Oh, and you're definitely the worst sinner that ever walked the world. And how dare we? I mean, it was just literally a how dare we. We didn't debate whether what we had said was true or not true. We didn't even really debate the rights or wrongs of it, really. It was just the whole thing was based on how dare we. And then they twisted it about 3/4 of the way through. They twisted it to how dare I.
Back to the woman.
Back to the woman. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And the funny part is the leader of the church, John Hales, had warned us going into this priestly visit. He said, at some point they're going to try and divide the 2 of you. He said, I wouldn't be a good friend if I didn't warn you of that right up front.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I remember him saying it. And even after we hung up the phone, Rick and I looked at each other and we were kind of like, really? You really think they would go that far? Total babes in the wood here.
Yeah.
And after we got in there and got seated down, it literally came out. And then they started in on how dare you? How dare you influence Rick against us? You came from Nietzsche. We don't do the things the way that Nietzsche does. This is the attitude. We don't do things the way that Nietzsche does. We follow the rules. And they would quote different people that they had supposedly talked to, and they told us to do it. They never took any responsibility for shutting up people's kids or withdrawing from people's kids or for abusing people's kids. Mm-hmm. It was, we were told to.
They were being obedient.
Yes, we were being obedient. They saw nothing wrong with what they did. There was never any sorrow for what they did. They didn't show any compassion towards the kids. It was always the kids are naughty. It's their own fault, and we just did what we were told to. And we went through I think it was about a 5 or 6 month period where we were the target of every single church meeting. Every single day we would go to meeting, and the whole Bible reading would be about us. And every single naughty woman in the Bible was me.
Whoa.
I was a pillar of salt. I was the woman of scarlet. I was, unsubmissive. That was the favorite. Unsubmissive, in subject. I taught my husband wrong. I came up against the assembly. And this went on for 6 months.
Every day for 6 months.
Every single meeting. And in every single meeting, there's at least 150 local brethren sitting there. And then there would be interchange meetings. And it didn't stop for interchange because this was a very important issue. They had been challenged. Men in the PBCC do not like to be challenged by a woman ever, is what it boiled down to. At the end of the 6 months, my aunt and uncle lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And we finally, unloaded that this had all gone on. And they're like, you need to come to Winnipeg for a little while. And, because our choice was to leave the whole Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Or my aunt and uncle were like, it's not like this in every church.
Sure.
So we discussed it. We went back and forth. And we finally decided we would try and give it a go in Winnipeg for a little bit. And we went to Winnipeg, and we were in Winnipeg for 5 years, I think. And Winnipeg was the same. It was exactly the same. It ended up in this whole puddle of disarray as well. The good part is, coming out of Maple Creek, we had like this foundation developed where we realized what is in the Bible and the teachings of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church are two completely different things. They go down two separate tracks. Having that foundation is what saved us in the end.
So what was it, what went down in Winnipeg then that really, I don't want to say pushed you over the edge, but, really encouraged you to make that really big decision?
In Winnipeg, of course, it sort of happened at that time where there was the transition from John Hales to Bruce Hales. John Hales was the leader when I was in Maple Creek. And gotcha. He passed away in 2001, and his son Bruce took over. It was during that transition that in Winnipeg, everything just went nuts. It was in John Hales's time, but Bruce Hales decided to clear the slate. And that's kind of a funny word to use, but that was probably the most conflict in a leadership change that we had seen. Bruce Hales, to anybody that's out, will tell you, Bruce Hales had already made up his mind. He was taking over from his father. And in order to do that, he had to get rid of anybody that might be in conflict with him. And he did that.
So he was planning it.
He was planning it. Yes, he was definitely planning it. And he literally cleaned out anybody that might challenge him getting that position. In doing so, he got rid of my aunt and uncle in Winnipeg.
Oh, wow.
And that just literally made it black and white for us.
Yeah.
We were like, okay, this totally puts it in black and white for us. We can totally see this is not a religious group. This is a cult.
When did you start using that word? Was it in that time period, or did it take you a while to come to that conclusion?
It was when we were in Winnipeg, we realized it was a cult.
You did? Yeah.
We didn't throw around the cult word as freely in Winnipeg. It was when we got down here to Tennessee and really established ourselves down here that we realized how culty the cult was.
Sure. You're out of it. And you're looking back.
You don't see them every single day. And then, the 10 top defining points of a cult are there in blazing neon lights. You can see it so clear when you walk away from it.
Did you take all of your kids with you?
We did. Our oldest was 13. So we had from 8 to 13. We took 5 teenagers. We packed them up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, rented a rental truck, loaded everything up. And mercy for us, my mom lived in Tennessee. So when we loaded everything up and came to Tennessee, I knew on this end, at least I would have the support of my mom. And she had remarried at that point, and Dad. So,
had she left the church?
Yes, she left the church right the year after I got married.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you were able to rekindle that relationship too when you left?
Isn't that the beautiful part of the story?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Someone that you've had no contact with for 10 years. So I had all my kids without my mom around, without the support of my mom. And then all of a sudden we make the decision that this is craziness and we're going to leave. And we pack up our kids and move them 1,500 miles away to Tennessee and literally pick up a relationship with my mom just where it left off.
That's incredible.
It is. It's incredible. And if there's anybody inside there that happens to be listening to this, and that's one of the beautiful things when you do make that decision to leave. It opens up, it's one of the things that keeps you in there. You're like, I won't have any support system when I leave.
Mm-hmm.
The beautiful part is you do. There's like this whole support system outside of there that it just surrounds you.
Yeah. And, it seems through Chris's reporting and Drew's reporting and just what I've read and the podcast that you have, that, like you said, with the internet, with your ability to make connections with people, it does seem like there's a safety net that wasn't there maybe, 10, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think social media has definitely brought about a safety net that wasn't there. Even watching those poor kids in Maple Creek, there was nothing to catch them.
Mm-hmm.
They were dumped out on the streets. There was no safety net out there to catch all those kids. There is a safety net now.
So when you were leaving with all of your kids, I know that's not the reality for a lot of families. I mean, just look at your mom leaving and not being able to have contact with you for so long, even though you were over 18. How did that feel as a mom when you were driving down to Tennessee and you essentially saved your kids?
It was both the happiest day of my life, or second happiest maybe, but it was also the scariest moment because you've packed up 5 kids that have grown up in Canada. You are taking them down to Tennessee. It is a whole new world. They've grown up in Canada. They were born in Canada. They've grown up in Canada. And it's not that Canada and the United States are so different. There's a lot of things that we're very much the same on, but there's just so many things that are different. So not only have you got to rebuild the kids' entire social circle,
Mm-hmm.
Then there's this whole thing where you've left your entire Christian belief, your whole church that surrounded you. And when you're in the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, I always like to refer to it as a cradle to the grave type of religion. And what I mean by that is you're born into it, and your whole concept and your whole viewpoint is that you're going to stay in that until you die. You're going to follow their kind of rules, their kind of patterns. And now it's even more so because you're only able to be employed by them. So that's your whole career structure. And then as you get old, families take care of each other, and literally you will die inside there. It's a cradle to the grave kind of an arrangement. When in the middle of that, you pack up your 5 teenagers or preteens and you move 1,500 miles away to a place where there is no branch of that religion, you have to start over completely. Your whole social structure, you have to find a belief system, surround yourself with people that sort of believe like you do. Mm-hmm. And you're putting your kids into a public school system that is like all new to them. They have to build all new friendships. And then you have to start a whole career path. Because leaving the way that we did, I knew coming down here that I was going to have to work. Because Rick came down here as he didn't even have a green card at that point. He couldn't even work.
Oh, right. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Sure, he's Canadian. Yeah.
So for the first time in my life, I was going to be the income earner for us. I'd never even held a job except that I did some special needs assisting at the school when we were kind of making that decision. That is the only job I had ever held. So in some ways, when I look back on it, it seems really crazy, but it was like we had made up our mind and we were just going to go with it. You went out there in faith. So for anybody inside there that's thinking about it, sometimes you have to make the hardest decision in life, but you do so because you know it's the only decision you can live with. For us, it was the only thing we could live with.
So I'd like to talk about the work that you're doing now with the podcast and the safety net and everything you're doing to speak out, to spread the truth. I'm wondering, what is your goal with the work that you're doing in that area?
It's funny that you asked that question. Anytime you try to speak out against the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, I've realized that it's probably from all of the cults. This is one common thing. When you go to speak out about some of these groups, about your experience in them, about things that you saw in them, they fight against you. They don't want the truth to come out. They don't want people to see them in a bad light. And I've had a lot of people say to me, why do you bother? You know, you successfully got your children out of the group. You kept your family together. You got them out of the range of where they could be harmed by this group. So why do you even bother? And I always have to stop and think, so why do I bother? There's sort of when you're born into a group like this, there's sort of the whole first 33 years of your life were in this group. You developed relationships. There was people that I saw in Nietzsche every single day of my life for the first 19 years, you know. And when you make the decision to leave a group like that, you can't cut those ties entirely. And I don't think it would even be a healthy process, because for the whole rest of your life, there's things that happen in your life. There's situations that will arise. And it all goes back to those first 33 years of your life. If you put that in a little file and push that file to the corner of your brain, when those situations comes up, you don't even know how to deal with them, because the answer to how to deal with them is in that box that you shoved to the corner of your brain. So what I found is that it is healthier to work through these things and process them and learn from them rather than to push them to the corner of my brain. In the process of working through these things and learning about them, you realize that there's other people out there that are going through the same trauma that you're going through. And it's through establishing those relationships that you start to work through stuff together and realize that you can help other people. There's other people out there that, you know, might be able to help you. They might have gone through a different situation than what you did. And it's in learning that all of a sudden it opened up in front of me that, wow, from what I went through in leaving there, in making up my mind, in choosing that this is not the same as what the Bible says. That whole process and going through that and surviving it and coming out successfully, I have certain talents, certain knowledge that I can help other people with. And I guess in establishing the podcast that we've established, establishing the Facebook groups, establishing all these different connections, it feels like I'm able to use all the negative things that happened to me. I've been able to turn them to positive to help other people. I think back on all those kids that left in Maple Creek, and I know a lot of them sort of follow the stuff we say in the podcast and whatever. And I want to thank them for opening my eyes. They went through so much, and there isn't a day that doesn't pass when I don't think about them and all the stuff that watching them taught me. So if there's a way that I could say to them, I'm sorry that I couldn't stand up and scream and yell and holler and say this is wrong. Mm-hmm. I would have. My heart was with you. And I'm thankful that you opened my eyes.
You mentioned that they listen to your podcast. So can you tell us where people can find that and your Facebook group?
Our podcast is called Get a Life Podcast. It is on a variety of different platforms. We also have a Facebook group. We have multiple different Facebook groups. There is a Facebook group called Get a Life, Expose the Truth. There is a Facebook group called The Truth About Bruce Hales. And the beautiful thing is we are noticing more and more insiders watching the Facebook groups. So that tells me as they are learning, they are reaching out to get more information. And I would say, guys, don't quit until you fully understand what you're in and what you really want. So if you're young, keep searching for what you're looking for. Don't just accept what is said because it is said repetitively and said in a fearful manner. Don't let that keep you there. If your heart's not there, don't stay there.
That's it for this episode of The Vault. I want to thank Carman again for taking the time to speak with us. That podcast, again, in case you missed it, is Get a Life, Ex-Cult Conversations, and you can find it on any podcast platform. There's a lot more to this story that we haven't been able to fit into this series of episodes, so I encourage you to read Chris Hagen's reporting series at inforum.com/thevault and watch Drew Trafton's 2-part documentary at inforum.com/WDAY+ to learn more. Chris Kurzman edited and produced this episode. I'm Trisha Taurinskas. Thank you for listening.